Okay, so we're coming back to part two of this lecture for this week on infant and toddler development. Um, I wanted to talk about infant temperaments. Temperaments is really interesting in that it is the seeds of personality, as we understand that for adults. Personality is one of the cool concepts in child development that most agree is equal parts nature and nurture. So there are some aspects of temperament that seem to be inborn tendencies about how we respond to the environment, but there's also a lot that is uh, socialized, right? We tend to react more positively to kids who react to their environments in certain ways. We may encourage certain reactions to the environment. So there's a little bit of both here. The other thing is that the ways that children are encouraged to react to the environment are gonna vary dramatically across cultural contexts. Um, I have a picture up here in the top corner of my niece, Sky, and she is one of my favorite examples of temperament because, man, this little small is a firecracker. This is her playing with the water table. So gleeful, so excited about the water, hands all the way in, fully thrashing with the water, right? This is Sky. She is amazing. Um, she is the child who was learning to walk and did one of those toddler face plants, as toddlers do when learning to walk. And everyone kind of paused. Oh no, is she gonna cry? What are we gonna need to do to soothe this child? Is she okay? And she stands up, quietly brushes herself off, and then goes, ah! And then keeps walking. She did not want consoling. She was just pissed that she had fallen. She was just angry, right? Love this kid. Perfect example of temperament, and very different in her temperament than either of her siblings. She has a sibling that's much more timid, easygoing, but timid and quiet, and then another sibling who's very outgoing and not quiet at all, but very kind of easygoing. So molds to whatever the environment is needing from her in the moment. So there's some temperamental differences that you may be familiar with from other classes, but temperament includes all of these nine aspects that are here on this slide. So activity level, rhythmicity, so regularity of biological functions, approach withdrawal, and this is usually to novel objects or people, adaptability, threshold for response, intensity of response, quality of mood, distractibility, and attention span. And I have a video that's was created for child development or for preschool teachers, for teaching preschool teachers about temperament, that I will post that gives some really good examples of this. So some issues with temperament. We have talked about temperament historically in three broad categories: easy babies, difficult babies, and slow to warm up babies. The video that I'm going to link to talks about um, they are flexible, feisty, and fearful. Um, I think the terms we always end up with one or two that are more negative, which is problematic. I mean, kiddos barely getting through the first half of their first year, and we're calling them difficult already. What the heck, right? But these are the terms that are most commonly used, right? Um, so these are the characteristics that those other nine aspects of temperament, we can kind of group these kinds of responses together: easy, difficult, slow to warm up. Easy being flexible, difficult being feisty, slow to warm up being fearful. So the issue here is that when we look at Thomas and Chess and others' repeated studies trying to look at what the average, how many kids fit into each of these categories for infants, we see that most kids can be qualified as easy babies, about 10% as difficult, and 15% as slow to warm up. I don't know how y'all are feeling about your math these days, but that does not make 100%. That is because there are a lot of kids that are hard to classify. So there's some problems with this general three broad categories idea, which again is why I wanted to post those 9 aspects of temperament, because there may be different patterns for how kids are interacting with their environment that don't quite fit in these 3 kind of typical types that we talk about, right? Also important to note is that there's moderate, that means about half the time, um, stability for the first 8 years of childhood. The stability for temperament, so whether you're going to stay a difficult baby if you started out a difficult baby, is higher for the extremes. So if you are extremely um, uh, vociferous, extremely loud, and extremely energetic in your responses to things, you're probably going to stick with that, right? If you are extremely regular in your biological functions, you eat and exactly half an hour later you need to go to the bathroom, you're more likely to stick with that, right? The more moderate types, or kids that kind of fit into sort of these 3 categories, are more likely to change. Okay, so focusing in on some social and emotional development aspects in these first couple years, we're going to focus in for the rest of this little lecture on attachments, just reminding you some of the main ways of looking at attachments. I believe I have one or a couple IO students in here who may not have seen talk about attachment for a while, if ever. We're also going to get into language a little bit, but most of the slides for language I've left for you guys to look through if you're interested. If you're interested in kids and communication, looking through the parts of communication is going to be really interesting and really important for you. But we aren't going to delve so much into that in this video. Okay, so attachments. This is, we start to see this as early as 6 months, and we start to see this in terms of separation anxiety, that there are some people that I'm more okay to be apart from than others. And there are a couple different ways of explaining this theoretically. The first would be Freud saying that we are attached to those who meet our needs for nutrition, right? I am attached to the people that provide me food, essentially, right? Erikson argued that this is a little, Erikson, if you remember, was a student of Freud. And so Erikson switched this a little bit and looked at we become attached to people who reliably meet our needs. And this fosters a sense of trust. So this is a little bit more global of a look at this, but it's also not focusing so much on the food, right? But that I am reliably having my needs met, right? So that's kind of a more umbrella version of similar concept to what Freud was thinking was going on. And then we see Bowlby and his work with the monkeys, which we'll talk about here in a second, looking at the ways infant monkeys who had a secure attachment or object, or those who didn't, differed in terms of how they explored the world. And this is key for thinking about the implications of attachment and what this means for children and later in life as well, about our ability to explore and perform healthily in our environment, right? So Bowlby argued that attachment creates a safe place, which we need for our learning experiences. So we have to have a safe place to come back to, a place that we feel comfortable in order to have those challenges and those experiences that help us learn and grow, right? So Bowlby kind of took Freud and Erikson's ideas about the attachment models and sense of trust, sense of somebody will reliably meet my needs, to what this means about how I engage with the world. Okay, so looking at Bowlby kind of based a lot on Harlow's monkeys, and so we're talking about the study that many of you probably saw in Intro to Psych way back in the day. If not, I'll attach a video for this as well. But looking at how monkeys dealt with a stressor and whether they chose to stay on a nice cuddly cloth monkey mama, as you can see the monkey huddling at the very top, or on something that provided food. So Harlow argued that it was not just food that the monkeys were seeking, because they spent most of their time on the fuzzy mama, and when they were alarmed by some mechanical toy, something that was new and strange, like this bear thing, that they would go and seek comfort from the fuzzy mama. So we're talking not just about reliably meeting our physiological needs, but also some sense of comfort, right? And this is going towards Bowlby's idea about the secure base. This good positive connection, this attachment, provides us with a base from which we can explore the world. I know I am safe. I know I can come back to this secure spot, so I feel free to go explore the rest of the world. Okay, so while we know that tactile sensations and touch is really important for infants, it can be the difference between actually physiological as well as cognitive and psychological growth for young ones, and not, right? If babies who are not held and caressed don't do as well physically, as well as other developmental milestones. It's not enough just to have that sense of touch, right? Social interactions seem to be necessary and helpful for everything from our primate ancestors, the monkeys that Harlow studied, as up into including humans. The other thing to consider here, though, is that what social interactions look like may be very different across cultural communities. And this is part of the issue with looking at attachment broadly writ, is because of the fact that while this sense of let me build a model for how I can expect the world to deal with me, right, is really important. And this internal working model idea that my first emotional security connections with a caregiver kind of set the stage for what I expect from the world, in terms of whether I can trust people, whether I will have a safe space from which to venture out and explore the world, right? Those internal working models are really important, but what they look like and whom they're with may vary dramatically across cultural contexts. So in some places, a lot of the research has been done on cultural or on attachment connections with mom, right? In some communities, this may also be dad. In other communities, this may be grandparents. In some communities, this is older sibling, right? So if some of the ways of understanding and looking at attachments can be problematized because of the fact that what caring social interaction looks like, whether that's highly verbal, whether that's highly tactile, who that's with, may vary dramatically across cultural communities. Okay, so these are types of attachment looking at the strange situation from Ainsworth. I'll also attach a video clip from YouTube about this. And again, you've seen these before. There's secure, where the kid it feels confidence that mom is going to be back. The kid is more okay with mom or other caregiver than strangers, and caregiver is able to calm the child after an alarming situation, right? The avoidant here is kid is indifferent and not connecting to mom when mom is there, may or may not cry when mom leaves, and is just as comforted as by somebody else as by mom, and then is also kind of indifferent to mom when mom returns. So not a real strong preference for main caregiver over other people, and may not show kind of secure base behavior with that person. They're not going to necessarily come back to circle back to mom or other caregiver to get that reinforcement. The resistant ambivalence is also interesting. This is also called anxious attachment. And so this would be when the kid is seems to be fearfully and clingy onto the caregiver, kind of afraid the caregiver is going to leave when the caregiver is there, and then real upset when the caregiver leaves, but then also not entirely comforted when they return. And then this last bit, which is really interesting to me, because I've seen some very specific behaviors that seem to show this, simultaneously seeks and resists this renewed contact with the caregiver. I had a video, and I'll try to find this specific video and post it, of a kid who, when the mom comes back, mom tries to reinterest the kid in a toy, and the kid reaches for the toy and is about to be, getting comforted by mom, and reaches for the toy and is about to engage with the toy, and then goes, "Nah!" and starts crying, right? So I kind of want to be okay with you again, and I want to trust, and I want to go back to a happy place, but I am still very hurt that you left, right? So it's kind of a push-pull there. And so those are the types of attachment that Ainsworth articulated. So why do we see variation in this? Some reasons for variation: parents' differences in how they interact with the kid. If parents are going through a lot, they may not be able to consistently respond to their child. So if parents are going through trauma, if parents are going through stress, they may not be able to provide consistent reinforcements for the child, which is pretty much agreed upon, that some consistent way of reacting to the child is necessary for secure attachment. We can also see some things that are characteristics of the kid. Some kids may be more likely to attach to objects than others. This may also be a cultural difference, because in some cultures, having an attachment object is much more common than in others. So other kinds of things that are going on between, and this kind of links back to the parental behaviors, stressors in the family, maternal depression, marital problems between parents may get in the way of parents being able to provide that secure attachment kind of feedback that the kid would need. And then lastly is some cultural influences, which I hinted at before, but whether the kid is used to sleeping at home, whether the kid is used to sleeping elsewhere, what is the normal setup for children in that cultural context? If the kid is more likely to be with mom most of the time, if they're more likely to be in a boarding school kind of situation, they may be attached to somebody else that's not mom. So this is kind of cultural differences in terms of what attachment behaviors look like, but also who is the primary attachment. Okay, so some other things about moving into toddlerhood, kids are moving around, and being more upright, being more mobile is a good kind of instigator for new relationships between parents and children. um, Parents and kid may see kids start to have new expressions of relationships. They're bringing things to a parent to talk about, to explore together. They will have new expressions of relationship. They'll seek hugs in new ways. So this moving around entails new kinds of ways of relating to parents. Okay. We can also talk a little bit about the visual cliff studies and looking at what kids are learning from their moving around, right? So kids are learning from their exposure to moving around the world that some things are not safe and some things are. So they're not only getting new rules and new relationship or ways of expressing relationship with their caregivers, but they're also learning about slope and learning about cliffs and learning about what kinds of things they can explore on their own and what they need help with. Um, Another thing to note here is that these practice and ability to explore um, may vary dramatically across kiddos, but also across cultural communities. Kids who are allowed to move about and are in safe spaces that they can move about are more likely to get some of this information and experience from moving around their worlds that kids who do not have that access may miss out on. And this active engagement in the world is sort of leading to kids starting to develop this sense of self, the sense of I am mine. I'm starting to have new relationships with the world and kind of understanding their body and space. So there's a lot that we're getting kind of through this motor experience and that's coming online at the same time. So we talked in the first set of videos last week about stages. This is a good case for stages, right? These early motor changes, because there's a lot that's changing at the same time and they all kind of seem to go together in a coherent structure. Okay, so you guys have heard of Piaget's sensory motor stages. I'm assuming this is ways of thinking about the cognitive development of infants and toddlers. So the first couple years, moving from substage 1 being just reflexes to primary circular reactions. I am enjoying the feedback I'm getting. To secondary circular reactions, I can interact with the feedback I'm getting, right? I can act on the world and see that there are effects or there are results from the things that I'm doing in the world. Then we see kids starting to have some intentionality and do early kind of combining things to get certain outcomes. Stage 5, we start seeing problem solving. And then lastly, symbolic representation. So I can see one thing as standing for or symbolizing something else. And Piaget, the order of these is less argued about in contemporary work, but the timing of them seems to be that kids go through some of these stages much earlier than Piaget had imagined. Okay, so object permanence. This is just a kind of review because many of you will know this one already. Object permanence is the mental representation of an object that I can't currently see, right? It's an object or a past event. The idea is that I can know that things exist even when I can't see them. And this is not present for early infants. Piaget had early infants look for things to see if they would look for things that were missing. And then secondly, see if they would reach for things that are not missing. So remove a handkerchief from over a toy that had been covered. And the main thing here is that with a lot of these tasks in early infancy, it's not like I get it once and then I totally understand it in all contexts and all permutations, right? It's more like I kind of get it in this context, but then I don't get it in this other context. So there's a little bit of trial and error in this. An example here, if I cover the apple partially, the kid might find it. If I cover the apple completely, the kid will not, right? So there's still some wiggle room within the object permanence. It's not kind of one and done. This lack of representation also works for tracking the course of a thing. I have actually seen this happen with my nieces, where I'll say, "Hey, look at the airplane," and the airplane will go behind a tree. And if you're watching an airplane and the airplane goes behind a tree, you take a few seconds and imagine how long it's going to take, and then you look for it coming out the other side of the tree, right? Um, Kids who do not have solid representation are not going to do that. Oh, look, there's the airplane. All right, it has disappeared, right? So they're going to continue to look for it in the place that it disappeared, not following the track on which it would be reappearing. All right, so by substage 4, kids are being able to find concealed objects, but they will do this, what we call A not B error, which is they look for the object in the last place they found it, but will not continue to look for objects after a while. This is an example here of A not B error. I'm putting it under putting this object under the handkerchief. Kid's gonna look for it. So even if they have seen me hide it, they may not look for it again. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about language. So for one of the major milestones in this early part of life, these first couple years, is language. Language is really cool and really interesting. We don't often think about it because it's so common and it's so easy for us as adults. But language is a structured system of arbitrary symbols that we use to communicate meaning. There is nothing about the word boat, B-O-A-T, boat, that means a thing that I go on and sit in water and don't drown. Like there's nothing about those sounds together, except for that we have all agreed in English that's what those sounds mean, right? So this is symbol use in a very arbitrary but cultural way. Language is structured, it's governed by rules. We have past tense, present tense. It is arbitrary, as I just said, there's nothing about those specific sounds that have to mean that thing. And it is communicated. So not all communication is language. I can go, when I see somebody, I can smile when I see somebody. That is communication, but it is not language because it is not structured, it is not governed by rules. And not all language is verbal. So ASL, American Sign Language, is a form of language, and it is not verbal. Okay, so another cool thing about language is that once you know the rules, the possibilities are nearly endless. I can say all kinds of crazy, weird sentences that you have never heard before, but as long as you know what the vocabulary in those sentences mean, you know the rules of how to conjugate things for past tense, present tense, then you are going to understand what I meant. It's also abstract, so it's a use of symbols to talk about things that are not immediately present. Gives infants and toddlers the ability to talk about things that may not be right in front of them. For infants and toddlers, they're going to tend to, at least initially, mostly talk about stuff that they can see and it's right in front of them. However, they are beginning to use, towards the end of toddlerhood and into early childhood, they're beginning to talk about things that they can't immediately see and touch. And this is something that Piaget said that kids weren't able to do until much later. So this is an important aspect of language. Language kind of bridges these barriers that way. There's a lot that we do with language before we get to actually speaking. I'll leave this there. Oh, I wanted to talk about what jargoning is. Jargoning is using the sounds of language without actual words. We go up at the end of questions in English. So a kid can ask a question without using words, and we can recognize it as caregivers as a question, right? So jargoning is using the sounds of the language without words. Okay. And then I wanted to say there are several subsystems of language. In the slides, you can look at these some more. If you understand the subsystems of language, the pieces of language, it's easier to understand what it takes for kids to learn each of these pieces. So if you're interested in that, you can go further in the slides. All right, that's what we've got for this week. Thank you. There we go.